Good evening and welcome to Face to Face. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Niresh Eliatambi. Over the last 6 days, we have witnessed a miracle in the Middle East. After 2 long years, Gaza has a ceasefire. Prisoners and hostages have been released. Troops have moved back considerably to agreed upon lines. There is food and medicine aid flowing into Gaza now, although a lot more has to be done. And all this took place in just less than a week. And to discuss all this and the ramifications of all of it, I have with me Mr. Nilanthan Niruthan, who is, of course, the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies, CLASS. Good evening, Nilan, and it's lovely to have you back on the show.
Good to see you. Always lovely to be here. Thank you.
Right. Nilan, how did this happen? After 2 years and everything seemed to be, the war in Gaza just continued on and on and on. Something like 67,000 people had died. And there was a massive assault on the city of Gaza by the Israeli military. It was ongoing, and there didn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel. But all of a sudden, peace has broken out. So tell us, how did this come about?
Yeah, so over the last few months, there's certainly been a growing realization on both sides that this deadlock was going to continue perpetually if nothing was done. Because even though the Israelis were managing to make a lot of progress in terms of infrastructure destruction, Hamas had kind of almost dispersed into very, very little groups. And it became very clear that this could go on, it could become another Afghanistan if there was no intervention. So there's certainly been a realization on both sides that they can either fight to the death or they can come to some kind of compromise. There has also been certainly a huge amount of pressure from Washington, which I'm sure we'll get to as well. Trump has played a huge role in sort of really pushing, well, whether he's pushing it for his own interests or not, on really pushing this as Washington's primary foreign policy priority over the last few months as well. And I think just in general, there's been a realization that if Israel does not compromise at this point, then Israel is not going to be able to negotiate from a position of strength. So right now you've had the almost complete destruction of Hezbollah. You have the total wipeout of the Hamas leadership, particularly thanks to the Qatar attack. And at this moment is when they are in a position to negotiate with a lot of leverage. And, neighbors like Qatar have also kind of been quite shocked that the Israelis were brazen enough to attack them and that a treaty ally like the United States was not really going to retaliate. And that they couldn't really play both sides and be this hub where non-state actors could come to negotiate with hostile nations and things like that. So both regionally and nationally, there's been a realization that something has to be done. I saw this funny joke earlier on the internet, which doesn't capture it that well, but it's quite amusing and it gets the essence of it. So Obama calls Hamas and says, let's negotiate. And Hamas says, no, we're going to bomb everything. Biden then calls Hamas and says, let's negotiate. And Hamas says, no, we're going to bomb everything. Trump then calls Hamas and says, I'm going to bomb everything. And Hamas says, let's negotiate. To a certain extent, having this huge amount of uncertainty over when things might escalate, thanks to the most powerful nation in the world itself being perceived as unpredictable, it's certainly been a huge leverage in making this possible.
Interesting indeed. Now, we know that in war, there are really no winners. Everybody loses, or almost everybody. In your opinion, in this particular war, this terrible Gaza war. Um, who are the winners and who are the losers?
Well, in the long run, I think we would have to agree that in any ceasefire, the first winners are the civilians because they get some respite from the violence. So the ceasefire itself is typically seen as a win for the civilians, and we should go with that. It's in the big picture been quite a win for Israel as well because many of the non-state actors like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, none of them are as big a threat right now as they were 2 years ago. So in that calculation, the Israelis have come on top. Fatah, which is the other Palestinian organization that rules the West Bank, is a huge winner out of this. They hate Hamas even more than they hate the Israelis. And the destruction of Hamas and a potential for some kind of international rehabilitation of Gaza, it augurs well for them because they might have to play a strategic role there as well. And it's also, let's face it, been a huge win for Trump. I mean, Trump is now he brought Thailand and Cambodia together to the White House to agree to a peace deal. He brought Azerbaijan and Armenia together to the White House to agree on a peace deal. When he said he's going to stop tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia over the River Nile Dam, people laughed at him. But then you have Egyptian ministers now telling the international media that they're going to award Trump the Order of the Nile Civilian Award. India, Pakistan, even though India says Trump played no role in it, the Pakistanis very clearly say that Trump was the most important reason for them bringing things to a stop. Now, I've just mentioned Thailand, Cambodia in Southeast Asia, Egypt, Ethiopia in Africa, Azerbaijan, Armenia in Central Asia, and India, Pakistan in South Asia. So in very different parts of the world, this guy, for whatever reason, has managed to bring people to the table and to stop hostilities. I can't think, whatever anybody's personal opinion might be, I can't think of any modern political figure or really any political figure who has brought this kind of preliminary approach to peace all over the world the way that Trump has. So I would say these are the major winners of this. As you say, there are no winners in a war, but these are the people who've come out with a lot more leverage. The ones who've lost a lot of leverage, Iran would be one. Most of the non-state actors that I mentioned earlier were essentially backed by Iran, and their decimation has kind of put Iran on the back foot right now. They can no longer channel Hamas through Iraq and Syria because Iraq and Syria no longer have anti-West governments in place. You could say on the major geopolitical scope, Russia now might cede some kind of PR to the Americans because the Americans are the ones who are now making moves for global peace. I mean, Azerbaijan, Armenia is in Russia's backyard. Thailand, Cambodia is in China's backyard. And yet it was Trump and not Xi Jinping or Putin who actually brought those two leaders together for a resolution, right? So, and the final losers, and this is probably a good thing, are the extreme right wing on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side who oppose any kind of reconciliation, who've always used this argument of you can never bring these guys to one table. They've always used that as an excuse to say that even attempting peace would be a waste of time. So this has been a big blow to their narrative as well. So in general, I would say those are the first round of those who've gained leverage and those who've lost leverage.
Now, Nilan, what are the real prospects for peace? Yes, the guns have fallen silent, but it takes a lot more than that to achieve a permanent peace. And obviously, there are many stumbling blocks. And let me ask you directly, what about the state of Palestine, which has now been recognized by 170 odd countries around the world, and quite recently by nations such as France, Canada, Australia, the UK, and so on. So in that respect, what about the state of Palestine? What about Gaza? And a permanent peace?
Well, as the Indonesian, Prime Minister said at the UN General Assembly 2 weeks ago, once it's acknowledged that Israel has the right to exist, the prospects of Palestinian statehood also become much stronger. So the problem right now is that you always get into this question over, do you accept that Israel has the right to exist? And the Israeli right wing has to contend with the question of, do we accept that the Palestinians have the right to exist as a sovereign state? Now, while you're certainly right that many new quote unquote Western countries have made moves to recognize Palestinian statehood, it's yet to be seen whether these are ceremonial acceptances of their statehood, or whether there's going to be some institutional capacity put behind it, like diplomatic channels being opened and treating them like an actual sovereign state and things like that. Ultimately, look, it's going to be decided by three power factions: the Americans, the Arabs, and the Israelis. And right now with this, it's very clear that all three of them are on the same page in terms of the basic arguments. So if you look at the basic arguments of the 20-point peace deal that was actually put forward, so Hamas is banned from any kind of administrative duties there. Hamas has to disband militarily and has to take down all their tunnel infrastructure and all that. These are all conditions to this deal. There will be an international committee, a board of peace, with the likes of great humanitarians like Tony Blair, for instance, presiding over that board of peace. You will then have what's called an ISF, an international security force, coming in to make sure that law and order is maintained and things like that. So now all of these things require a great amount of infrastructure and bureaucracy even before they get off the ground. And when we look at the timeline, if I'm not mistaken, this ceasefire itself is split into three phases. Phase one, the Israelis withdraw a bit, about 50%, and they stop the airstrikes so that aid convoys and things like that can start operating with more freedom. Phase two would be Israel then withdrawing a little bit more, when you then start having an international security force coming in to make sure that there's no relapse into violence and things like that. And phase three, the Israelis would completely withdraw, barring a buffer zone of something like 1 kilometer or something like that. And the rest would be completely under Palestinian control, well, under the Board of Peace's control, which will act for Palestinian interests. So on the extreme positive side, you could say that they're going to turn Gaza into Dubai. On the extreme negative side, you could say this is a clear-cut case of international military occupation. So it actually fits the bill for both. So those are the roadblocks.
Right. Well, I see one immediate stumbling block, which is the disarmament of Hamas, and whether they would agree to step away from actually governing Gaza, which they were elected to do. I mean, they didn't take it over. They were elected in an election, and although of course many countries refuse to recognize them, including Israel. But what are the prospects that the disarming would happen? Would they disarm?
Well, the Israeli logic is that if they don't disarm, then we just go back to doing what we were doing. And this time we face even less international pressure, because they are the ones who now back out of this treaty that now, I mean, Trump brought, as you pointed out earlier, about 28 countries there to send a very strong message that the quote-unquote international community, for the most part, I mean, obviously Russia and China and all that are a different story, but that for the most part, a large chunk of the international community is in agreement with this framework. So if Hamas refuses to disarm, then the Israelis would just go back to doing what they were doing, and they would face even less pressure than before. So we've got to remember that there's an incentive built in place for Hamas here as well, which is that the Hamas leadership which surrenders will be given complete amnesty. So this is a great way out for them. And maybe some of them would even start touring Germany and France and the UK and all that. These university lecture tours, my fight for freedom, my fight for justice, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, this is a very common thing in a post-conflict situation, right? You would see them writing New York bestseller lists, books and things like that. So they do have certain incentives there. As you rightly point out, making people sign a peace treaty is easy. Making them abide by it is far more difficult. So step one, making them sign the treaty, is done. Step two is the far more complex task of making them abide by it. The peace deal, if I'm not mistaken, also has a clause that the neighboring Arab states have a responsibility to militarily intervene if Hamas refuses to disarm or if Hamas goes back on the promises made in this. Now, the Arab countries by themselves, you could argue, do not have a peacekeeping military capacity in that sense to take on Hamas. But, I mean, they could always get in their primary military partner from the North American continent to come in and do that for them. So all of these things are built into the treaty itself.
Interesting. So let's hope that in the days to come we will see positive developments.
Certainly.
Now, a particular surprise to me was the summit of so many nations in the Egyptian city of Sharm el-Sheikh. Of course, we expected a few nations, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and so on, and perhaps some of the European ones as well. But 28 nations, you had India and Pakistan and various countries from Africa, they were all there. How did that happen, this sudden outpouring of support? Or was it that all of these countries realized that, this is the best chance for peace and they need to support this?
Yes, I think that's certainly the case, that they realized that, number one, this was a good way for them to be a part of something that is potentially historic. If you notice, all these European leaders just stood there at the back cheering Trump on, when we all know what their comments about Trump were just last year. But now they've realized that for them to be relevant in international politics, they need to be a part of movements like this. They need to be a part of moments like this, the optics, this understanding that you are part of a wave of geopolitical momentum, this understanding that you're a part of a certain worldview that is currently prevailing in different parts of the world. As you rightly pointed out, even though Prime Minister Narendra Modi did not go, they did send a high-level delegation there. There were other heads of state there. Pakistan sent their head of state, Indonesia, so on. In general, Trump is just good at putting on a show, and he's just brought the United States back to this kind of energetic level in geopolitics, where everybody knows that it's good for them to be a part of it, for the optics at least, and for the chance that it might give them some concessions with Trump later, which might also happen, right? Who knows? So, yeah, I mean, let's face it, nobody wants the Israel-Palestine conflict to continue. Nobody, you can't find a single person other than the extreme right wing on both sides who actually want this to continue. Even if you ask the typical pro-Israeli crowd or the typical pro-Palestine crowd, nobody says we want people to keep dying. So in that sense, this represented some kind of attempt at reaching an agreement that people thought couldn't be reached, and Hamas coming on board and Netanyahu coming on board, I think was seen by all these countries as, hey, this is a good opportunity for us to be a part of history.
Right. Now, President Donald Trump personally thanked each of those nations one by one, calling their leaders up there to the podium and singling them out and saying, this guy has been really great. He's been supportive. What a wonderful country. And he said that about Egypt, about Qatar, about every country which was there, 28 of them, plus the European Union, plus the League of Arab States. So it was a marvelous PR opportunity for all these nations. And President Trump himself would obviously remember that they were there to support him. Now, my question to you is, why weren't we there, Sri Lanka? And I put this to you in the context of this. 50 years ago, we were there when something happened internationally. Mrs. Bandaranaike, with the non-aligned movement, I mean, she rubbed shoulders with Castro, Tito, Nasser, and so on, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and so on. Before that, we hark back to J.R. Jayawardena and his address at the San Francisco Peace Conference in the 1940s. So Ceylon, as we were known, and then Sri Lanka, we were someone on the world stage. We weren't a huge nation. We didn't have huge economic power or military power, but people knew us. Why weren't we there now at this moment when the whole world was watching?
So this goes back to a point that I've raised on your show many times. Whenever I'm here, we keep having this discussion of what exactly is our worldview?
Our national interest.
Have we identified what our national interests geopolitically are? Have we identified what our alignment in geopolitics is? Have we identified what exactly our foreign policy is, which can be transferred from one ruling administration to another? So this is obviously not a party specific problem. This problem is not specific to any single political party. What we've seen over the last several years is that regardless of who is in power, our foreign policy, we are more or less like a leaf blowing in the wind, right? The question of why weren't we there could almost be twisted into why should we be there? Why should we be invited for something like this? Do we have a worldview? Do we have an alignment? Do we have a role? So, for example, when you pointed out to certain leaders from the past, now any of us could very clearly say this is what their worldview was. This is what their alignment was. This is what they stood for. As long as they are in power, these are the leaders they get along with. These are the leaders they perhaps don't get along with or don't really know well. Right? Everybody knows that Mrs. Bandaranaike and Mrs. Indira Gandhi were very close friends. Everybody knows that President Jayawardena, for example, the famous dinner with Ronald Reagan. Right? So there are identifiable things. Now, over the last maybe even 20, 25 years,
or even a little further,
we have to a certain extent lost that. We have lost that, as you said, people knowing who we are, us actually being a proactive voice rather than just a reactive voice, where we were seen as a country that stands for something. All of that is gone. I mean, Trump will invite you if you're a player or if you at least have the potential to be a player in the geopolitical chess game. Our problem is that we have stopped playing the game itself. Go on.
We've withdrawn from the world stage.
Well, we've withdrawn from the world stage, and we've also not really identified what our priorities are. Right? So, for example, if you go to almost any strategic discussion here, you would keep hearing the word strategic location. And almost every discussion about foreign policy, defense policy, geopolitics and all that about Sri Lanka always goes to this issue of our strategic location. But what have we ever done with that? We've not done anything. I mean, Donald Trump is a real estate agent. He looks at Gaza as a piece of real estate. Are we willing to deal with leaders transactionally, where we say we are in a strategic location, but who has ever gained from it? Have the Indians gained? Have the Chinese gained? Have the Americans gained? They all gain at one point, and then we shut them out in favor of someone else in 5 or 6 years. That's the merry-go-round that we keep going around. So We've not really done anything to leverage what we have. And in the absence of a long-term geopolitical worldview, it was inevitable that we would become irrelevant.
Now, when I said the world stage, diplomacy is a stage, isn't it? It's a drama. It's all about being out there and gaining that reputation for your country, and we're not doing that. I would say the past 6 or 7 governments in Sri Lanka have been woefully inadequate in that respect. So we haven't been there. And even now here was an opportunity which presented itself, and many countries grabbed this opportunity. I never expected India and Pakistan and Indonesia to be there. Obviously, the Middle Eastern nations, yes, and the European ones, but would you have expected, all these Asian nations to be there as well? So we had the opportunity. Even if we weren't invited, perhaps we should have told the US government we'd like to be there as well. I'm sure they would have extended an invitation to us.
Yeah, certainly. But for us to be proactive, we need a vision. We need a foreign policy tradition of standing for something. We need a foreign policy philosophy. We need recognized foreign policy objectives for us to be able to say we've got to do this in order to fulfill these objectives. As you and I have discussed in many episodes of this show, we don't even have a piece of paper that lists down what our country's foreign policy interests are. Something that a 5-year-old can do with a piece of paper and a crayon has not been done here. And therefore, because what you are suggesting, for example, attending this summit, for instance, it's a proactive move rather than a reactive move. And in order for us to be proactive, there needs to be a base. It needs to be a conceptual base or an ideological base or just having a worldview, which we've simply not had. So as simple as it looks on the outside, this is, as you rightly point out, a long-term problem. And this is just a symptom of that long-term problem.
Now, if you look at it transactionally, Sri Lanka is still negotiating to try to bring down those pesky tariffs of 20%. We would like to have it brought down further. There are countries which have got 10%, so we know it is possible. And when you are negotiating for something like that, wouldn't you want to grab such an opportunity, be there and have Trump say, "Oh, thank you very much, Sri Lanka." He may not even know where Sri Lanka is, but he would thank us, and then we could remind him later on, we were there, we supported the peace effort. And surely that may be worth something. I mean, it's no risk, is there?
Yeah, I mean, as you pointed out, this would have helped enormously in terms of our engagement with Washington and all that. And I'm sure the people who are in charge of that would have loved it if we had actually attended this summit. Right? But once again, I mean, you could be passionate about cricket, but if you don't have a cricket bat, you can't go out there to bat. You can't just go out there and bat with your bare hands. So you need institutions, you need tools, you need an extra something other than simply intention for these things to manifest. And unfortunately, even if there might be many, many well-intentioned people, the structure, the vision, none of that is in place. I mean, as I keep saying, we don't even have a piece of paper. So that's the answer.
Well, perhaps the Center for Law and Security Studies, of which you are the executive director, should gather together the experts and come up with such a vision. Because are we waiting for our politicians of all parties to get together on
Well,
this?
the first move is to create public awareness. And that's another thing in which there's probably been a huge dip as far as the country itself is concerned. I would argue that perhaps during Mrs. Bandaranaike's time and all that, the public discourse about how we engage with the world was also a lot healthier, a lot more vibrant, many more opposing viewpoints, all coming together to hash it out. We don't really have that. to a certain extent. As you know, Center for Law and Security Studies, we put out a geopolitical risk index every Monday that goes out to all our subscribers, that recaps events all over the world, providing some kind of analysis on how this might impact Sri Lanka. But our readership is still very small because, once again, these discussions are unfortunately not mainstream discussions here, as they should be. In an India or a Pakistan, they would have been mainstream discussions, whereas you don't get that kind of public engagement here either. So we've got to get that public engagement going to where it will become a political reality for our bureaucrats and our politicians to be proactive.
But Nilan, do we have time to be strategizing here? Because we're still recovering from the economic debacle of the last, the 2022. And we are desperately trying to get foreign investment. But either investors have never heard of us, Sri Lanka, or they have that negative image of back in 2022, what the country was like. So we need to use every opportunity to show that, hey, we're back. We're normal again. We need to sort of push that narrative. And at the same time, we're trying to get more tourists to come here. And what is more importantly, tourists who are wealthier, who are more upmarket, who will spend more. So to do all that, we need to place ourselves very firmly on the world stage.
Yes, and to place us very firmly on the world stage and to attract the kind of investment and the tourists that we are talking about, we would once again have to go with somebody's momentum rather than always staying at the back and trying to play both sides against each other or three sides against each other. So for example, Gaza now, if things go well, and I hope they do, all this talk about Gaza becoming another Dubai or Singapore, let's remember that it's practically difficult, obviously, but in theory, there's nothing, illogical about that. In theory, on paper, there's no reason for Gaza to not become the next Dubai or to not become the next Singapore. It's the practical considerations that are stopping it, right? So here in Sri Lanka, if we want to go with that level of pace, then we have to take a few very clear-cut decisions over who our primary friends are, whom we are willing to lose over this, what kind of engagement are we willing to give them, what kind of integration are we willing to get involved in with them. We would have to answer all those uncomfortable questions. But I don't think any political party here actually wants to answer those questions, because it might even be political suicide for them if you take up too much of a stand one way or the other, where you might be accused of working covertly for the Americans or the Indians or the Chinese or whatever. But in order to have that transformation, you need to go with somebody's momentum. You cannot be a leaf being blown in the wind. You need to pick a direction in which the wind is blowing, and the leaf then just has to keep gliding along. But we've not done that.
But Nilan, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we are to attract major foreign investment, not these dribs and drabs which come in, we need to be somebody on the world stage. We shouldn't be in that situation where we go to a Fortune 500 company and they say, where are you located again? Where is this Sri Lanka? They don't need to Google us to know who we are. So we need to get out there. So otherwise we are not in consideration for such investment.
Absolutely.
We saw this a few days ago. Google just announced a $15 billion investment in Visakhapatnam.
Yes.
Which is just a couple of 100 kilometers off Jaffna.
Yes.
How come they got it and not us?
Okay, so the Fortune 500 question is a very important one, because it gives us a proper workable look into what the problem is, right? So now let's say you're a Fortune 500 company. I'm a country that you never heard of. right? Doesn't have to be Sri Lanka. It can be any country that you've never heard of. Now, what are the things that you will look at? Okay, so whose sphere of influence is this unknown country in? Is it in the American sphere of influence? Is it in the Russian sphere of influence? The Indian sphere of influence? So on, right? The second is, what is this country's relationship with the master of that sphere of influence? If I'm in Russia's neighborhood, what is my relationship with Russia? If I'm in China's neighborhood, what is my relationship with China? The third thing they would look at is, okay, so which strategic bloc does this unknown country belong to? Does it belong to the Western alliance? Does it belong to whatever the Russia-China alliance, for whatever it's worth? Or is it some sub-Saharan African country? So there are very basic practical questions that you would ask yourselves, which could all be solved by having a basic geopolitical vision. So because you as an investor would be all those things that I've mentioned right now. Yeah, they are business related questions. They are investment and stability related questions. But ultimately, these are geopolitical questions. These are geostrategic questions. So as long as we have a geostrategy, investment will come. We have, I mean, there are many countries that have recovered from much worse situations from us. There are many countries which have risen to great heights. I mean, look at, for instance, just two allies of the United States. Take a picture of South Korea and Saudi Arabia from the 1940s and 50s, before they became so close to the Americans, and take a picture of Saudi Arabia and South Korea in the 2020s after a generational partnership with them. This is how this is how you go to the next level. But we have never done that. We have never even considered that, for all I know. So your geostrategy has to be good, and investments and all that will come pretty automatically if we get that in order.
Yes, because I mean, it was stunning when Google announced this $15 billion for Visakhapatnam.
Yeah, but Visakhapatnam has also been doing a lot to attract foreign investment,
right,
and things
but
like
that
that.
is
Yeah.
on the back of India's geopolitical strategy, isn't it?
Exactly. Yes. And India has a, whether we agree with it or not, India has a clear geopolitical strategy which they are sticking to. So,
I mean, we're talking $15 billion from one company, and we got $1 billion over the last year from all the companies
yeah.
combined. Of course, it was an improvement over the last year, so we're happy about that. But then this is the kind of big money which is out there, and we should be looking at, and something's holding us back here.
Yeah, that something is a lack of policy continuity and a lack of geostrategic vision. I mean, the other thing you would ask yourself if you were a Fortune 500 company is, okay, so do these guys have consistent policy, or do they just play merry-go-round with their policy? And unfortunately, we don't have a very good track record, on that question either.
Right, and we are almost out of time. And my final question is, where does this leave President Donald Trump? Because his image goes up and down. Back in the USA, he's at war with many of his
The government
cities.
shut.
The government, the US government is shut, and he has deployed troops to Los Angeles, to Portland, to Memphis, now to Chicago, Washington, D.C., and he's talking about New York City as well. So he's in many ways, he's not the most popular back there, but overall on the world stage, this has really lifted him up, hasn't it?
Yeah, certainly. I would say that he's been on a steady trajectory up for a while now. As I pointed out earlier, why is it that Thailand and Cambodia would rather go to Trump for mediation than China or the UN? I mean, these are two, the fight was over two Hindu temples. They didn't even come to India. They went to Trump. Why is it that Armenia and Azerbaijan went to Trump instead of to Russia? Why is it that Egypt and Ethiopia went to Trump? Why is it that Serbia and Kosovo, Trump claims, came to them? Why is it that Pakistan is acknowledged? So there's a very clear method to his madness. There's a very clear track record he has of bringing people to the negotiation table. Whether these negotiations succeed or not is a completely different story. But I ask anybody watching this program, regardless of whether you personally like Donald Trump or not, go through 5,000 years of recorded human history and you ask yourself if you've seen another figure in 5,000 years of history who has been hailed in as many parts of the world for bringing peace by those leaders. Remember, this is not Trump sitting in a room by himself saying he's the one bringing peace. Thailand and Cambodia acknowledge that Trump is the one who brought peace. Armenia and Azerbaijan acknowledge that Trump is the one who brought peace. Egypt and Pakistan acknowledge that Trump is the one who brought peace. And we see this with the Israelis and the Arabs as well. So regardless of what we might think about him, this is some kind of historic achievement that he's pulled off here. Of course, tomorrow everything might just break into chaos and Armenia and Azerbaijan might be at each other's throats again, and Thailand and Cambodia might be at each other's throats again. But the fact is that he has still achieved something that every other world leader on that stage has dreamt of, but none of them have actually achieved it, and he has.
Right, and on that note, we must leave you. My thanks to Nilanthan Niruthan, Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies class. Thank you very much, Nilan, for being with me this evening. And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.